Tonight, I'm thrilled to introduce Jay Hoberman, who's truly one of the greatest of all American film critics. If you're looking from the dawn of the form onward, I can't tell you the number of filmmakers I first discovered diving through archives of his writing and lists that he made. Ho Shao-shen, Jan Svankmajer, Alexei German, Julia Locktiv, on and on. I mean, you can honestly say one of the greatest of all film critics, period, but I'm focusing on the American factor of his work because it's going to be of crucial importance for the book he's presenting today. For decades, he served as the late lamented Village Voice's senior film critic, and since then has regular features that have come out for outlets like the New York Times, Film Comment, Artforum, the New York Review of Books, and many more. And his many books over the years have reflected the very wide range of his interests in the film form. He is, after all, the man who made Game 6 of the World Series the 5th best movie of 1986. Many of those books have been rooted in underground and avant-garde traditions, as those are some of the traditions that he really came up through. There's his collaboration with Jonathan Rosenbaum in 1983, Midnight Movies, study of Yiddish filmmaking in 1992 called Bridge of Light, his profile of Jack Smith's revolutionary art film Flaming Creatures from 2001. But alongside these more seemingly esoteric projects, there's also been his Found Illusions Trilogy, which is a stealth history of mid and late century America as told through its popular art. And he caps off that series with his latest work, Make My Day, which traces the 80s through the lens of its former movie star President Ronald Reagan and the movies surrounding him at the time, Ghostbusters, Top Gun, Platoon, E.T., The Right Stuff, on and on and on, setting those movies against each other as representatives of the era's political landscape, whether they would choose to admit that or not, passing themselves off as pure mass entertainment or directly commenting on topics of the day and before. And as with all Hoberman writing, it revels in complexity. It finds both joys and dark underbellies of everything at one and the same time. Tonight, he'll be joined in conversation with Glenn Frankel, longtime journalist for The Washington Post, Pulitzer Prize winner in 1989 for international reporting, and a fellow film historian, having previously published books on The Searchers and High Noon, and with a forthcoming book about Midnight Cowboy, currently scheduled to arrive in early 2021. So with that, please join me in welcoming them both.
Well, I think Jonathan covered it pretty well. I'll ask a few questions, and then, the best part's always when you ask questions. It's great to be here. I'm going to call him Jim. We won't ask him why it's J period, but you might. I guess I just want to start in ground one question, just in how you got here. I mean, you're a New York guy. You grew up in New York, started going to movies very young, but it's one thing to go to movies a fair amount. It's another thing to become immersed and make it your life's work. I know you've never had a steady job, but and especially now that The Voice is gone. But what is it? What got you into it so deep?
Well, I'm looking for a quick way to say this. I think that like many people, a young person in the late 1960s, movies were what there was. I mean, seemed to be. I mean, I guess for some people it was music, and the two are not unrelated. But movies seemed to be the great art form, and I just was interested in all kinds of movies. I mean, the first movie that I ever remember seeing twice, actually paying to see twice, was Dr. Strangelove, which may say something about how I then developed, because, that was a movie that I took very personally. And other than that, I kind of backed into, I always wanted to be a writer, and I used to keep a journal, but I really did not set out to be a film critic. The short thing is that I picked up The Voice one day, and I saw that a guy who I went to high school with had the cover story, and I was thinking, if this guy could do this, I could do this, and that's what got me going.
So, this book, as Jonathan pointed out, is the third and final volume of a trilogy, though they've been written in odd order. I've read the first two. It's kind of like reading in reverse. The Dream Life was the first one, right, which is about the 60s.
Yeah.
The second one is Army of Phantoms, which is one I really love, possibly because it told me things about High Noon I never knew, even after doing research. That's the late 40s and early 50s and mid 50s. And now this one, the Dream Life, takes us to a character who's been in sort of in each of those other books, but now he really comes to the fore, and that's President Reagan. We'll get to him in a minute, but I want to ask, in the preface to the new one, Make My Day, it's not a work of film criticism, you say, nor is it strictly a history. So what is it?
Well, I think of it as a kind of chronicle. I mean, I think that Jonathan put it very well. I mean, it's a history as refracted through the lens of popular culture, and mainly movies. And, I had a certain working premise for all of these books. One was that, that Hollywood and politicians in a democracy have something in common, and that is they want to generate scenarios that are going to appeal to the greatest number of people. That paradigm has shifted, of course, in the last 2 years. But this is one reason why I see Reagan as the culmination of Hollywood, because he was able to really bring this worldview into the political arena. And the thing with I also think that Reagan was sort of, although I didn't realize it at the time, responsible for me embarking on this. Just the idea was so fascinating. This is going back to 1968, when he was the governor of California, but even then he wanted to be president. And I had the great privilege of being in Berkeley that summer. So I had got another sense of Reagan, which never left me, as my personal enemy. But I think that, initially I thought that, Reagan, of course he would be good in politics. He knew how to hit his marks. He knew how to take direction. He knew how to get a great voice on the radio, all these things. He was very good with one-liners. So he was in the movies. Of course he could do that. But then as I began working on this, I realized that he was in the movies and the movies were in him also, that this was truly his ideology. And, Hollywood had a particular ideology of happy endings and kind of sanitized history and comforting lies about things and, how families should be. And he was able to, having grown up in that industry, to really just project that in a way that no other politician really could do, or even would have occurred to them. Although clearly Kennedy had a kind of star quality, was charismatic in a Hollywood way. But Reagan was a professional, and I don't know if have you ever been to the Reagan Library?
No.
Has anybody? It's like a little theme park or something. It's really strange. It's like a shrine in Simi Valley. It's on a hilltop overlooking Simi Valley, and so I had spent a couple of days doing research there, and it was very frustrating. First of all, because it has like this sort of atmosphere, this kind of like smile button atmosphere, as you would imagine, this sort of like so affirmative and so like sort of sappy, and it was very frustrating because I could not really get things that I wanted to get, and then I kind of realized that why that the presidential libraries are probably designed not to help you learn things, but in a way to keep you from learning things. But one thing that I did take away from this was the incredible interest that he and his wife Nancy, who also had been in movies, kept in Hollywood. It was as if, being president is very nice. I mean, you can't knock it, but being even a second-tier star in Hollywood that is it. I mean, that they really were lived, literally and figuratively among the stars. I mean, and that community meant a tremendous amount to them. And so they were always, sending birthday telegrams to this one and that one, and he's calling them up. Somebody asked me if anything would turn up in his letters. I don't think so, because I think he was a telephone person. I think he liked to, and he saw, they watched a lot of movies by themselves or with their entourage at Camp David, and then, look at an Eastwood movie, call Clint up, and tell him what he thought of them. I mean, so his take on movies also would have been very interesting, but his attachment to the industry, the best example of this is, it seems to me that they spent the better part of a month working on a little anniversary tribute to Lew Wasserman. Lew Wasserman at that time was the head of Universal. He was really one of the most powerful studio bosses in Hollywood, but he had also been their agent. And so here he is, the president and the first lady, sending this like treacly, almost obsequious homage. Oh, Lew, how great he is, what you've done for, just going on and on with a typical Reagan joke. Well, I'm going to be out of a job soon, so we'll be calling you up, and this kind of thing. And, Wasserman was also the leading fundraiser for the Democratic Party in California at that time. Didn't mean anything to him. Reagan didn't care. The guy had been his agent, and that was part of that other world. And so I found this, in a funny sort of way, this humanized him for me. I still found it, strange, but it made him more understandable in a way.
It's a funny time in Hollywood, isn't it? Your book actually begins before the Reagan presidency, sort of in the mid-'70s. It's after Watergate. It's during Watergate. It's toward the tail end of Vietnam, and the movies are getting pretty dark and paranoid. Things like 3 Days of the Condor and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Taxi Driver, Network, and All the President's Men, in Nashville especially. They're all pretty dark. And yet at the same time, some other kinds of movies are beginning to bubble up that are very different and been very influential. American Graffiti is 1973. And you've got a great quote here from George Lucas. One of the ironies that your book points out is that the people who create the sort of new, sunnier movies actually come from the new Hollywood. George Lucas and Steven Spielberg being the chief culprits.
Come from the counterculture in some respects, although not, sort of they were influenced by that.
But George Lucas was very much a sort of rebel in his time. Yeah. And he says it was time to make a movie where people felt better coming out of the theater than when they went in. It had become depressing to go to the movies. And so first American Graffiti breaks through, and then, of course, Spielberg comes out with Jaws. And then Rocky, which doesn't have anything to do with New Hollywood, but Rocky arises and beats All the President's Men and Network for Best Picture. And finally, Star Wars. And so these guys, it's a really complex time because you've got the old paranoia that's still playing itself out. And you've got, we'll talk about Oliver Stone maybe later, but, coming up. And yet at the same time, there are these shoots of a whole different kind of Hollywood that seems much more Reagan-esque.
Yeah, well, Rocky and Taxi Driver are both the same year.
That's right.
And so you have Taxi Driver probably, arguably the most extreme of the new Hollywood movies. And Rocky, which sent every critic who saw it back to, Frank Capra to try and describe what was going on there. And I think that there were two things there were three. If you think of that Jaws also, although in a funny sort of way, Jaws has a kind of political subtext to it. But, it's just, you have Jaws, this kind of enormous pre-sold project, which opens everywhere at once, like television. It's everybody, everybody is talking about it at the same time. And it's a new way of making a movie. And then you have Rocky, which changes it. There will be no more feel-bad movies after Rocky. Every movie will be a feel-good movie. And not only that, every movie will end in this kind of delirium, affirmative delirium of like if you remember, the whole world is celebrating Rocky. It's no coincidence that the theme for Rocky is the go-to music for every politician. Now, they all use it as their walk-on music or their walk-off music, because, it's such a powerful, cue, let's say, towards positivity. And then Lucas and Spielberg, although it's true, they are, I mean, Close Encounters is kind of a counterculture movie. I mean, Star Wars is also, but they have, enshrined the mentality. It used to be a cliche, that movies, and maybe it still is, that movies were made for teenage boys. But Spielberg and Lucas dropped the age down, to pre-adolescents, to 11 or 12-year-olds, and that became the model too. So these were, huge shifts in Hollywood, and they're going along with a kind of consolidation of the industry as, fewer people,
It's intriguing. We talked earlier before we got here about our grandchildren. Mine are a little older than yours, some of them, and they're hitting the cycle of Star Wars. They're hitting these, and E.T. We're all sitting there watching E.T. together in tears. And I remember when we showed it to my kids, it has, and E.T. is sort of the mega, both success and also epitome of this. You have the great thing. One of the great things about Jim's book is he always tells you things you don't know. And at one point you described George Will, the political columnist, lashing out at E.T., saying he didn't like it. He said it had 3 subversive ideas in it: children are people, adults are not, and science is sinister. He missed the whole religiosity of E.T. But
yeah, that's interesting.
So what's your indictment of E.T.?
Well, I certainly did enjoy. I mean, I saw it under very, unusual circumstances, because I saw it at Cannes. It was the first time I went to the Cannes Film Festival, and so I had been in France for 2 weeks, and so this was the closing night. So of course, it was like this sudden, it hit this. It's so American. I mean, I loved it. And then the other thing was that somehow they used to be more relaxed in those days. My wife, said, "You're going to Cannes, I'm going to," and she had, our daughter was like 2 or 2.5. So somehow, this could never happen now, I was able to walk we just brought her into the movie with us, and she watched it. She sat on our laps and watched this movie. At the end, she said, "Why did that big turtle have to go home?" So of course I have a certain fondness,
right,
that has nothing to do with the quality of the movie. But the point that I was trying to make in the book was that, E.T. and Blade Runner appear almost simultaneously. And E.T. is this enormous hit. Everybody loves it except George Will. And Blade Runner, a movie which would go on to be considered, a classic and the first postmodern film, and have an enormous amount of academic writing about it, and also cults, was generally hated and just dropped like a stone. So when something like that happens, I always say, well, what are people getting from E.T. and what are they not getting from Blade Runner? And so I use that as something as the basis for part of a chapter, and that's a way that I like to work. I like to think in double bills, to have something, and it's antipode or something, to play them off against each other. Rocky and Taxi Driver would be another example.
Well, Reagan's not responsible for these movies, and yet you list a group of films that, to your mind, really sort of sum up, the Reagan era. The key texts, you call them, and E.T. is one of them. An Officer and a Gentleman, because I guess of the military, and it's praise for a sort of masculine militarism. Raiders of the Lost, especially Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which you really deeply hate. We'll get it. You and George didn't have any comment on it, but we'll get to you. And Red Dawn, which you would expect to be a Reagan classic, but Beverly Hills Cop makes this list.
Yeah,
and so does Ghostbusters.
Well, Ghostbusters is key. I think
it's the key. All right, let's go there.
I mean, Ghostbusters. Maybe some of you will remember this, or maybe not. But the summer of 1984 was very, very crazy. in my experience, it was comparable to Beatlemania. I mean, this Reagan mania. It just was, astonishing. This outpouring of love and enthusiasm for him during the election. And of course, 1984 was a year that everybody had dreaded and been worrying about. 1983 is full of these things. 1984, what's going to happen in 1984? Because of George Orwell. And of course, that was like complete. By 1985, that didn't matter anymore. But in 1984, it was a big deal. And there were some interesting movies that came out that summer. I particularly like Gremlins, which, we could talk about some other point, but I did hate, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which just struck me as like inordinately racist and sexist, even by their standards, even by Hollywood
it's a Hollywood movie, right?
Yeah, but this went way beyond, way beyond. And evidently, it was violent too. That didn't register on me, so that their parents didn't like it either. So I really found that, an awful movie. But Ghostbusters was a funny movie, was a light movie, and I saw it then, like everybody, and okay. I mean, I didn't even think it was as good as these Saturday Night Live skits. I mean, it was funny, but the fact that people loved it so much was, to me, a cue to something. There had to be some reason for that. I mean, it's not that great a movie. And so there's something ideological there. And, it's still true to this day. If you think about the incredible hatred and vitriol online that came against the remake, it was astonishing, especially since, the cast was at least as talented, if not more talented than the original cast. So what was the beef? Why were people so clearly this was some kind of sacred thing. People really loved it. And so I make a number of analogies between this and Reagan, but I should say at the onset that I don't see it as an allegory. It's not like a story. It's not like it's that I see it as a symptom, and I see Reagan mania as a symptom. Well, they're symptoms of the same thing, and that's what, I try to get at. And, George Will didn't write about Ghostbusters, but the Wall Street Journal did. In their, in an editorial, and they said, that this is like business school perfect, and they're right. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, it's set on the campus it starts on the campus of Columbia University, which is still, like the emblem in some respects of 1968, that campus. And Bill Murray, says, well, he's in the private sector. They expect results. So he's already dumping on, academia. And then, you have the character of the EPA guy, if you remember, who he refers to as like Pencil Dick, or he says some like incredible, nasty name for him. And this guy is like of their generation. I mean, he's a cohort of theirs, and he's not a square. I mean, he's got a beard. He's got, he's sort of with it, but he's so lame. He wants to enforce these environmental rules and these regulatory rules. And this is all about, getting rid of that. Then you add to that the fact that they're working on they call it the essential defense science of the next century. Now, this movie was in production in 1983, which is the period when Reagan was really ramping up the Cold War anxiety. I mean, with the Evil Empire speech and the SDI, which very quickly was named Star Wars, which, to show you how little the Democrats and Reagan's critics understood at the time about his appeal, they thought that was making fun of it. Oh, it's Star Wars. And, to show you how good Reagan was at this, he said, well, I didn't, that's not my name for it. That's not my name for it. But, it's going to do this, and it's going to do this, it's going to do this, and may the force be with you. So he winks, and he's able to bring it back, so there's that. And then there's the main thing is that, the EPA guy has a very important role as an inoculation, because he accuses them of of essentially being arsonists who then put out the fire. They create, these visitations of ghosts and so on, and then they do the exorcism. And because he says that, and because we know that he's, like an impossible, killjoy, like character, we don't think about it that way. But that is, in essence, what they do. And to me, that was an essence of Reaganism. I mean, he ramped up the Cold War, and then he was able to defuse it. I mean, we see something like that now. I don't know that I want to go there immediately, but on a daily basis. I mean, it's just part of our life now, that to create a crisis, and then, have it, somehow dissipated, maybe. So all these things, I think, made Ghostbusters very relevant to Reagan. And then, of course, I mean, I couldn't resist, it's like, wasn't there, like a specter, haunting Europe that somehow, is dissipated. Mm-hmm. So it's like a longing for the end of the Cold War too, which I understand. But anyway, that's the reasons why I think that Ghostbusters.
It seems like such an innocent time now in some ways. I mean, Reagan starts out as such an ideological figure, but he emerges in spite of so many foreign policy screw-ups and not a great economy as this sort of figure that rises above the ideology to become sort of the national father.
Yeah.
I love that moment where he calls Oliver North on the phone after North has testified for a few days about Iran-Contra, which is the biggest embarrassment of the Reagan administration. And what the president North reports that North was heartened by a telephone call of gratitude from Mr. Reagan, who, according to one acquaintance, began the conversation by suggesting that the revelations of recent days would make a great movie.
Yeah. Well, Ali mania was quite a thing too. By this time, I mean, I should say that for a long time it was considered really sort of tasteless, if not gauche or naive, to analyze Reagan while he was president as a media figure or somebody who comes out of popular culture. I had a lot of, I did these articles at the Voice, and I should say that the Voice was a place where I could do this. But, the political writers were not crazy about that. I'd be writing this thing about Reagan and rather than doing, real reporting, I would be analyzing how he was described in Time magazine or something, you know what I mean? Like looking at how he was being presented in the media and using that. But by the end of Reagan's term, everybody was doing this. And 1988 is a good case in point, that election where you had two fairly uncharismatic candidates, the first George Bush and Michael Dukakis. And I forget who was covering them for the Post, but the New York Times sent Maureen Dowd and Frank Rich to cover this election. These are two reporters, and they're both terrific. I mean, who come out of entertainment reporting. I mean, Frank Rich had been a film critic and a drama critic, and Maureen Dowd had been reporting on Hollywood, and it made perfect sense, and they were able to analyze this campaign. So when Oliver North turned up in these hearings in the summer of 1987. It started, of course, with film critics doing things because he was just like, they couldn't not see him as Mr. Smith Goes. I mean, everything about his testimony was like Gary Cooper, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. So, there was a lot of analysis of that. And then it registered. And after that thing came, Hollywood was interested in him. He really was like the flavor of the summer. And there was a lot of talk of him, being the vice presidential candidate and so on. And then it ended. It ended. That bubble burst. But, he was sort of like, a little Reagan who emerged, when the big Reagan was in a kind of state of confusion. This little doppelganger, this mini-me turned up.
So speaking of a state of confusion, this will be my last question, then I'll turn it over to you guys. We've moved on from a sort of supporting actor in Hollywood to a reality TV guy. And we had a couple of messianic presidents between them, but now we've got somebody very different. As I say, someone who makes you almost, or some of us, almost nostalgic for Reagan.
I'm one. Didn't he say that?
Maybe.
Say I'm the one.
Reagan's movie was America, you write, or rather America as it imagined itself. Far less cornball. Trump's movie is Trump as America imagines him. Have movies lost their grip on public imagination?
Yes, I would say the short answer would be yes. I mean, they're just not as important as they were. And this is, not an overnight thing. This is a gradual thing that was happening throughout the 80s and the 90s and so on. I think that there are certain things which people, or at least people, I never, anticipated, certainly. I mean, when I was a kid, if I thought about the future, I thought about moving sidewalks and personal, like, jetpacks and stuff like that. Like the Jetsons. That was going to be the future.
Of course.
It never, ever occurred to me that everybody was going to be walking around, like hooked into this, into this, invisible system. I mean, but everybody. And I don't remember reading about that in any of the science fiction. Maybe Philip K. Dick could have had, in some ways, some sense of this. Dick Tracy had the two-way wrist radio, right? That's, yes. And that made it, and the moon made also, but, so I think that things have changed so radically in some respects. Not entirely. I mean, the other night, I introduced a double bill of King of Comedy and Videodrome, two movies from 1983. And, what it occurred to me, that whereas, movies now, if you see a phone booth, it's like, hello. I mean, this is, like now I feel like a grandfather, if I see a phone booth, what is that? Like in a movie. But both of those two movies from 1983, even though they're ostensibly about television, they really, everything in them is completely applicable to the internet, I feel. So, there is some continuity. Circling back to Trump, but Trump is unlike Reagan, certainly, but also Kennedy, or he's not he didn't grow up on movies. He grew up on television. Television is really different, and of course he became a star in reality TV, which is its own thing, and something that occurred to me in terms of so there are two things. First of all, Reagan, it was in his nature as a Hollywood person to want a happy ending, to want to bring people together, to want to, make up these pleasant fantasy. I mean, he was capable of being dystopian, but basically he liked, to come up with, New Morning and, this picture perfect world and so on. That's not Trump's style at all. On the contrary. I mean, he likes, division. He likes dystopia. He likes, he has a whole different worldview, which I think comes out of probably, talk radio and reality TV and, cable news and, maybe wrestling. He was involved in that too for a while. And that's very different. And so, for any other president, a 40% approval rating consistently would be really terrible. I mean, they would be really upset. But Trump doesn't think that way. I mean, 40% Nielsen rating is fantastic. And, it's funny to think of that, but he's not wrong. I mean, he's in terms of gauging where he is with America. And so I think that what I said was that Reagan was like a kind of a magician. He could be, like the master of ceremonies, like getting, painting these incredible, visions. And, people like that. I mean, his voice was as important as anything else. But Trump is the star in a way. It's all about him always. And, what can I say? I never saw the Apprentice until it was way too late. And so I never saw this guy coming. I mean, I had no idea that that's, how America taking him in. I mean, I had a very provincial view. I mean, you know, we used to like attack him all the time in the Village Voice, you know, like week after week, you know, as like a con man and a charlatan and a bad businessman and just forever. And, if you want to, have your heart broken, I would say read the book that, my, late colleague, Wayne Barrett wrote in the 90s about Trump. I went back to it. It's like too painful to read. So, you know, I used to, think that, well, if people had been reading Wayne, you know, this wouldn't have happened, but no. It would have happened no matter what.
Yeah, it's time to move on to questions.
Yeah. I'm going to pass the microphone this way.
Thank you very much. This is a bit of a digression, but this is my only opportunity. It's with Andrew Saris, who was the presiding force at the Village Voice for many years, his auteur theory, quarreling with Pauline Kael and the Paulettes. Did you subscribe to auteurism, or what was did you have an ideological?
Well, I saw myself as being, you know, I was like the younger generation, right? I mean, so I read the American cinema when I was an undergraduate, Saris's book. And, you know, I knew it by heart. I mean, there were parts of that I've never forgotten some of his descriptions. However, I had a different take on, I mean, I learned a tremendous amount from Saris. And, but I was more interested in, you know, foreign films and underground movies and political documentaries. I just had a different sense of, I was also like a child of 1968 too. I mean, you know, for me, Godard was, you know, I mean, that was my sense of movies. So I didn't really agree with his taste. Kael is somebody who I admired as a writer. I thought she was a great writer, but I just had no agreements. I mean, to me, it was what she was doing just seemed inconsequential. So when I became, you know, when I became a professional, you know, I was working with Saris, Andy, I can think of him, you know, and we had different points of view. I mean, we weren't pals, but I certainly, sympathized with him in this, you know, struggle with the Paulettes as they were known, who were all male, by the way. I mean, but that's a very complicated thing, and she's a complicated figure, and I quote her a lot in my books, more than I would have expected, because I think that she was, although I disagree with her taste in movies very often, I think that, well, first of all, she's a wonderful writer, so she's great to quote. I mean, it's wonderful to like swipe stuff from her and have her in there. But her sense of, you know, her sociological, you know, perceptions can be very sharp. And of course, she would have hated to be referred to as a sociological critic because, you know, she's a child of the 30s. So she internalized all this stuff. And she was like, you know, rebelling against that. If you ever read her review of Salt of the Earth or something, I mean, or even worse, you know, like Abraham Polanski's Tell Them Willie Boy is here. I mean, she hates it. So she, you know, there's like this, I don't know, this red past, whatever it is, you know, she hates like, having this kind of interpretation, yet she can do it because she grew up with it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my sense of them.
I wish I'd seen your Videodrome double feature. I think that was one of the best films of the early 80s. Yeah. I can remember dragging friends, wife, girlfriends, everybody to it. Everybody hated it. Uniformly hated it, did not get it, thought it was so fucking weird. Yeah. And it was. But Debbie Harry was in it too, you know.
That's right.
That helped.
People hated The King of Comedy too when that came out.
Oh, a great film. Yeah. My question though went back though to the 70s. And did you get into Animal House at all in your book?
If I do, it's just in passing.
Because I'll say the reason why is that I can remember very well coming out of the movie theater saying that, what was that, 78, I think? Yeah. Yeah. And thinking to myself, I saw it in Washington. I had been out of college a couple of years, and I thought, Jesus Christ, things have really changed, you know? Because the audience was all younger kids. They were laughing at horse. It was funny. I mean, it was very cute. It was, But, you know, it was sexist and regressive and and that whole lampoon thing, you know, of course, which led to Ghostbusters and the whole lampoon style was a real kind of detour or, I don't know, train wreck of culture, I think. Mm-hmm. At least I don't know which.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think when I talk about it's mainly in terms of 1941, you know, Spielberg's great fiasco. Well, it's not. I don't know. It's 3 hours long, so it's a commitment. But it's not without. I would say it's not without interest. It's not without interest. And the fact that it was that people hated it, you know, is part of it. And the fact that he was never going to go there again. But it was just an example of this incredible, you know, hubris, which, you know, he was going to like remake World War II to suit himself. And, you know, as fun, as entertainment. And, he went too far, which is why it's interesting, but also why, you know, he got all this, pushback on it.
I had a question about 1984 in terms of thinking about Reagan mania and the way, like I saw a video the other day of the Democratic National Convention was in San Francisco that year, and the
big mistake.
Yeah. It was definitely yeah. So it was interesting because there's these AIDS activists who were marching in front of the DNC headquarters and thinking about the way the AIDS epidemic was unfolding at the time. I'm curious, like I think it's easy to, like, as someone who was born in the 80s to kind of look back on the way the decade's been portrayed as this kind of Reagan, like, everyone loves this guy kind of time. And I'm curious how these movements and, you know, really difficult moments in the country's history are portrayed in popular culture and how you've seen that.
Well, AIDS was barely portrayed at all, although I do think it turns up in some movies very powerfly. And then the one, I mean, we were talking about Cronenberg. I think that The Fly is quite an amazing movie in that regard. But also I would say that it's interesting that Reagan, you know, AIDS only became real to him when a movie star who he knew, you know, Rock Hudson, died. And that's indicative of, there's something about Reagan. I mean, I think that Reagan was, you know, I don't have any problems about calling him a racist in the way that white Americans, I mean, you know, are without thinking. I mean, although he did do some, you know, he did his thing with the welfare queen and, you know, and so on. I mean, he did do some fairly egregious things, but I don't think that he was anti-Semitic, and I don't think that he was homophobic. And the reasons for that are because he came out of show business, and he just would have had to, you know, he would have had too much first-hand experience, you know. And which is not to say that he wasn't also, you know, like, didn't care. He was not particularly empathetic. But when a movie star got sick, that he could get. And I'll give you another example of this, which I found fascinating, is he was really taken with the movie Das Boot, this German submarine movie, which was you know, I think it was probably the first real German language hit in a popular sense, won an Oscar and so on. And he wrote about it in his diary. He said how strange it was. Basically, he's saying how strange it was to feel sympathy for the enemy. And that sounds very trite, but I actually think that he had, like, something happened to him. That was like a profound thing to him, because that was his way of apprehending reality, basically. And, you know, so it was kind of wacky, but it wasn't entirely bad. And that's part of the mystery of his personality. And I know there was something that you asked, but I think I went off topic. Yeah. But
no, it's okay. I guess how something like AIDS, or like the LGBT movement at the time was portrayed, or if it was portrayed in popular culture at all.
No, no. I mean, well, I wouldn't say. I mean, there was, you know, the Village People. I mean, it wasn't completely. invisible, but it was marginalized, and it certainly was not particularly that would have been as mainstream as it got. Yeah.
In terms of movie culture in the Age of Reagan, you've been talking about films made by committees. How about films that were made by individuals at that time?
Okay. Well, I think that both Cronenberg and Scorsese are strong film. They get to make, and Cronenberg especially because he stayed in Canada where he had a lot of freedom. There are certain personalities who I think come to the fore. I mean, probably the richest and most complicated one is David Lynch. I mean, certainly when Blue Velvet came out, there was nothing. There are no precedents really for that, and it kind of almost stands alone in the 80s. But people who later became somewhat more conventional also were making interesting commercial movies. I mean, I think that Joe Dante somehow managed to turn Spielbergism on its head, which was, he made movies under Spielberg's auspices, but at the same time, Gremlins is a kind of critique of that. I think that James Cameron's first two movies, The Terminator and Aliens, are very personal movies. And I'm not sure if you say committee. I mean, obviously, filmmakers always have people that they work with. But I was wondering if you meant by committee, you meant studio, things that are more industrial products.
No, there's not a good category for it. Experimental films, new American cinema.
Yeah. Oh, I don't write about that. Yeah. I mean, Lynch would be as close to that as I get, to avant-garde or to experimental. Also, there's a David Byrne movie, not Stop Making Sense, True Stories, which I don't much care for, but that's clearly a movie that's made outside of Hollywood. And I also talk about Pee-wee's Playhouse, even though it was on TV, because I think that was really something that appeared that was really fresh and personal and a kind of statement, and also amazing that it turned up. But it was for kids TV, and so that's maybe some of you saw it then. Me too. I was watching it with my, and I think I might have liked it better. I don't know, but it certainly was, yeah. So there's that. But this is not a book about. I mean, for example, yeah.
But for the moment, can you?
You mean what's going on now?
Yeah, as a postscript to your book.
Oh, gee. Well, I would say in a general sense that American independent film, starting in the 80s, but gathering momentum in the 90s, came to be, the R&D for Hollywood. That Sundance was a place, where young filmmakers would be able to do original stuff and somewhat experimental stuff. This is what B movies were for a long time in Hollywood. I mean, the B movies of the 1950s are tremendous. It's a great period for B movies and genre movies, because the studios, there was a built-in audience for these things, and the studio didn't really care. I mean, if all Westerns made money, which made it possible for people to make really interesting Westerns. That situation doesn't exist anymore. And if you're talking about avant-garde film that's in the art world, that's an even more special thing. However, I will say that's what my interest started there, and that I'm going back. I'm not going to do movies of the 90s or, God, I'm not going to do movies of the Trump era. I mean, that's for someone else.
I've got two more questions. There's one here, and then I'll do one back there.
So I think the list that was read at the beginning, all those movies were popular, were hits, which makes perfect sense for me when you speak of movies as a cultural barometer. Like they have to resonate with the culture. So I remember Frank Rich, for example, wrote, I think it was a Sunday Times Magazine piece on The Talented Mr. Ripley when it first came out, before it even hit. Mm-hmm. And his entire theme was, we're all frauds, and this speaks to the fraudulence of our culture. And I remember reading and thinking, well, how do you know that it speaks to it if it hasn't engaged with the culture and been accepted and celebrated by the culture?
Yeah.
Can a movie speak to our disquiet like Bonnie and Clyde if the audience rejects it?
No. I mean, in a broad sense, it's like it's a tennis match. It's like you can't invent the star. You can't go set out to make a cult movie. I mean, you hit the ball over the net, and if it's hit back to you, then you have a volley going. And there are a few movies that I talk about which were quite unpopular. I mean, River's Edge, if anybody's seen it, is one. And I spoke to them because that was evidence of some like dissident tendency, or some people who wanted to make up movies that were about something other than entertainment. They had something else in mind, and I wanted to recognize that. But by and large, what you're saying is true, and that the movies that I talk about were hits, or big hits, or gigantic hits. Although some of these gigantic hits were so uninteresting that I didn't even want to talk about them. But no, Top Gun, because that's a movie that I hated. So,
but it resonated though.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
completely.
It may be a bad movie, but if it resonates.
Oh no, completely. I mean, the Army was recruiting off of Top Gun. They set up tables in the in movie theaters, to get guys to sign up for the for the Air Force. I mean, that movie, I've never forgotten the press book. I saw that movie. I was a working critic also in the 80s, so I saw all these things, as they were happening. I had front row seat. But I'll never forget the press book for Top Gun has this quote from Tom Cruise where he's saying that a Top Gun instructor told him that there were only like 3 occupations worthy of a man.
Film critic?
Film critic was definitely not. I did make a joke of that, but that's all right. But it was jet pilot, movie star, and I was thinking, and president of the United States. So this really eliminated, like 99.9%, of like the male population. But isn't that? I mean, they're putting that out to promote the movie. They don't put that out to make people not want to see the movie. This is all about like getting people to want to see this movie. So, I mean, all this stuff, like a big movie like that. There's always something more. There's always something that's something that that was like an article of faith to me. That when something becomes, like that kind of hit. It's not just a movie. There's something else going on there. Some deep, need that it's speaking to, or satisfaction that it's providing. Yeah.
I'm 41. I cannot wait for the remake.
Well.
I'm so excited.
Okay.
And online, there's a lot of people,
this remake has been in the. I mean, I think this is not the first time they announced a remake.
Yeah, but the trailer's hit. So it's
okay.
Like 35
Well, there's also a truism in show. If it worked once, it'll work again, and it'll keep on working until it doesn't. They'll keep working it until it doesn't.
Do you think
and then
just the superhero movies, all the Marvel stuff, speaks to something in the culture now because they're massive hits?
It does, but it does. They don't speak to me. And actually, the best secondary gain or unexpected, whatever it is. What is it? An unexpected something or other. Unanticipated thing that I got from being, losing my job as a weekly film critic was that I didn't have to come up with things to say about them like week after week.
And we have our last question right here.
You've kind of touched on this tangentially, and you talked a little bit about Reagan's racism, but you haven't really talked about his sexism. And I think about all of these movies that are so lasting from that time. And I think I'm about the same age as your daughter. Those were the movies that I remember, and they really lasted from that era. They're all guy movies, and they have these female characters who are secondary. And what occurs to me is that the movies that Reagan was in, and even before that preceded him in the studio system, it's not so much the studio was run by women or they were written by women, but there were, women there, but there were these great women characters. And it's like it completely went away. So do you see a connection between him and what happened in the 80s?
Well, I don't see a direct connection. I would say that also, the audience, that women were considered a much more significant part of the audience in the 1940s and 50s. There were movies that, were referred to in the women's movies, but that was a significant part of the movies. Also, yes, there were some remarkable stars, all of whom he loved. And he looked at those movies. He and Nancy didn't just watch current movies. They were always going back and looking at movies from the 30s and the 40s. What you say about the sexism in the movies of that period, that's absolutely true. And I think that is something that I wouldn't say that it's introduced by Spielberg and Lucas, but it's given a lot of cover by Spielberg and Lucas. Talking about E.T., I was watching this movie with, with my daughter, and I see, the sort of the abject position that Drew Barrymore has in this movie, and it's integral to the movie, and that's, I think, so there's a structural thing going that goes on there, and I think that you're right to point it out. And we were talking about politicians' favorite movies, Glenn and I, and it came up, and I said, I don't remember how it came up, but the idea that if Thelma and Louise, if Hillary had just said that instead of, The Godfather, she mentioned Thelma and Louise as her favorite movie, the world would have come to an end, so that's. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.